Chapters 1 and 2 of Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire, by Walter Geer. Recorded by Céline Major. 1. 1763 to 1779. Early years of Josephine. On the outer rim of the Caribbean Sea, in the middle of the chain of the Lesser Antilles, between the British possessions of Dominica and St. Lucia, lies Martinique, the birthplace of Josephine. The island is only 40 miles long by 20 wide, and its area of less than 400 square miles makes it about a third the size of the smallest state in the Union. A cluster of volcanic mountains in the north, a similar group in the south, and a line of lower heights between them form the backbone of the island. The deep ravines and precipitous escarpments culminating on the north in the Massif of Montpellier are reduced in appearance to gentle undulations by the drapery of the forests. The few miles of country between the watershed and the sea are traversed by numerous streams, of which nearly 80 are of considerable size, and in the rainy season become raging torrents. At the southerly end, a lateral range, branching from the backbone of the island, forms a blunt peninsula bounding on the south the beautiful low-shored bay of Fort-de-France, on which is located the city of the same name, formerly known as Fort-Royal, the capital of the island. On this peninsula, directly across the bay from the capital, is the little hamlet of Trois-Îlets, where Josephine was born. By some authorities, Martinique is said to have been discovered by Columbus in 1493, the year of his second voyage, but it was not until 1635 that possession was taken by the French Compagnie des Îles d'Amérique. During the next 100 years, Martinique had a full share of wars. It experienced several revolutions of different kinds, and was attacked on numerous occasions by the British and the Dutch, but always without success. It was finally captured, however, by Rodney in 1762, and was only returned to France by the Treaty of Paris in the following year, a few days before the birth of Josephine. Like Napoleon, therefore, she had a narrow escape from not being born under the French flag. In 1726 there landed in Martinique a noble of Blois, named Gaspard Joseph Taché de la Pagerie, who, like many others, came to seek his fortune. He belonged to an old family which could trace its origin back at least to the middle of the 15th century. His great-grandfather had established himself in Blois in 1650, after having sold his seigneurie of La Pagerie, of which, however, his descendants continued to use the name. His grandfather, retired with the grade of captain of cavalry, exhausted his last resources in 1674 in recruiting a squadron of the noblesse of Blois. He left only one son, Gaspard, who, in spite of his good marriages, did not succeed in restoring the family fortunes. Gaspard left 2 sons, of whom the younger rose to considerable prominence in the Church. The elder, named Gaspard Joseph, after his grandfather, was a mauvais sujet. To escape a life of genteel poverty at home, he decided to try his fortunes in the New World. Little is known of the early years of his life in Martinique, but 4 years after his arrival, he presented to the Council a request to have his titles registered, in order to preserve his rights and privileges as a member of the noblesse. On account of the many formalities, and the delays in hearing from France, this matter dragged along over a period of 15 years. In the meantime, in 1734, he married a young woman of good if not noble family, who brought him a considerable dot. He was not at all successful in his business ventures, however, and was finally obliged to take a clerical position. By his marriage he had 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters. But we are only interested in the elder son, Joseph Gaspard, and the eldest daughter, Désirée. In 1752 Joseph Gaspard, who was then 17 years of age, left Martinique to take a position as page in the household of the Dauphine, Marie Joseph of Saxony, the mother of the future King Louis XVI. This place had been secured for him by the Abbé de Taché. After passing 3 years in France, he returned to Martinique with a brevet commission as sous-lieutenant in the navy. At this time, 30 years after the arrival of Gaspard Joseph on the island, the family was living in a state of abject misery, without money or social position. In April, 1755, in a period of entire peace between the two nations, an English fleet of 10 vessels, under the command of Admiral Boscawen, captured 2 French battleships near the south coast of Newfoundland. It soon became evident that plans had been laid by the British government to attack all the French colonies. In this emergency the king, Louis XV., had need in the islands of an officer of force and intelligence, and on the 1st of November, 1756, he appointed François de Beauharnais as governor and lieutenant general of all the French possessions in the West Indies. The new governor, although only 42 years of age, had a record of 27 years of distinguished service in the navy. Notwithstanding the fact that most of this period was passed at Rochefort, his native place, and that he had seen no active service, he was very highly esteemed for the efficiency with which he had always discharged the duties of his various positions. Monsieur de Beauharnais, who was not made a marquis until 8 years later, belonged to a family of the noblesse de la robe, rather than of the sword. He was the eldest son of a naval captain, Claude, and of a Mademoiselle Ardouinot, whose mother had married for her second husband, the then Marquis de Beauharnais. As nephew of one and grandson of the other, he was later to bear the title and to succeed to the Hôtel in the Rue Thévenot in Paris, where the Marquis died in 1749. When François de Beauharnais landed in Martinique as governor in May, 1757, he was accompanied by his young wife, whom he had married 6 years before. She was his cousin, and had brought him a large dot. He also had a small income of his own, which he had inherited from a bachelor uncle. They had had 2 sons, of whom only one was then living, François, born the previous year. What possible point of contact could there be between this grand seigneur, arriving as master in Martinique, rich with his income of 100,000 and his salary of 150,000 livres, and these Tachets living in misery in a corner of the island? As above stated, Gaspard Joseph had 3 daughters, and in some unknown way he was successful in obtaining for the eldest, Désirée, a position in the household of the governor as an upper servant or demoiselle de compagnie. Once installed in the mansion, it did not take her long to secure a dominating influence over the governor and his wife, and her favor was in no way diminished by her marriage to an ordnance officer of M. de Beauharnais, Alexis Renaudin, a young man of good family and connections. But it required all of the authority of the governor to arrange the matter, as the Renaudins objected strongly to the match, not so much on account of the lack of dot, as because of the general discredit of the Tachets. Finally, M. Renaudin, père, died, and the mother gave a reluctant consent. After her marriage the power of the young Madame Renaudin seemed to increase from day to day. A good husband was found for one of her younger sisters, a command in the militia for her father, and a place on the governor's staff for her brother. The administration of M. de Beauharnais proved a failure. Charges of such gravity were made against him in France that he was recalled from his government, and only saved from disgrace by the influence of powerful friends at home. By this time his infatuation for Madame Renaudin was so great that he was reluctant to leave Martinique, and the interesting condition of his wife served as an excuse. On the 28th of May, 1760, another son was born, who received the name of Alexandre. Still M. de Beauharnais lingered on the island, and it was not until the month of April in the following year that he and his wife finally sailed for France with the inseparable Madame Renaudin in their suite. In order not to expose the young Alexandre to the hazards of the voyage, he was left behind, in charge of Madame Tachet, mère. Before the departure of M. de Beauharnais, he arranged yet another marriage for the Tachet family, and on the 9th of November, 1761, Joseph Gaspard, the former page of the Dauphine, led to the altar Mademoiselle Rose Claire des Vergers de Sannois. She was descended from the old noblesse of Brie, and belonged to one of the most highly considered families in the colony. Rose Claire, who was born in August, 1736, had already passed her 25th birthday, and was very glad to find a husband. The marriage, which was celebrated before the Curé of Trois-Îlets, was not honored by the presence of any of the dignitaries of the colony. Even the father of the groom was not present for some unknown reason. From this marriage there was born on the 23rd of June, 1763, a daughter, who 5 weeks later received in baptism the names of Marie Joseph Rose. This was Josephine. During the 3 following years, Madame de la Pagerie had 2 more daughters: Désirée, born the 11th of December, 1764, who died at the age of 13, and Françoise, born the 3rd of September, 1766, who died at the age of 25. At this point we find a confusion in the records which is not easy to explain. Under the date of the 5th of September, 1791, there is an entry of the burial of Marie Joseph Rose. There is also in existence a document of questionable authenticity from which it would appear that a Demoiselle Taché gave birth, the 17th of March, 1786, to a daughter who was adopted by Madame de la Pagerie, and was given a dot of 60,000 francs by the Emperor Napoleon 22 years later, on the occasion of her marriage. In the certificate of baptism of this child, the mother may have borrowed the name of her sister Josephine, who was certainly in France at that date, and the same name quite naturally might be used in her burial certificate. In any case there is no possible doubt as to the personality of Marie Joseph Rose, nor as to the date of her birth. But this confusion of names and dates enabled Josephine, when she wished to appear younger at the time of her second marriage, to claim that she was born in 1766. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the struggle between England and France, was signed on the 10th of February, 1763, but the news did not reach Martinique until the end of the following month. The French fleet, charged with taking possession of the island, arrived the middle of June, and the white banner of the Bourbons was hoisted once more, just a week before the birth of Josephine. In the meantime in France, M. de Beauharnais, through the support of powerful friends at court, had succeeded not only in having suppressed the record of his unsuccessful administration, but in securing a pension of 12,000 livres, the rank of chef d'escadre, and the title of marquis. At the same time he also obtained a small pension for M. de la Pagerie. Madame Renaudin, after passing a short time in a convent, openly took up her residence with the marquis both in the city and the country, and his wife, who seems for a long time to have been blind to their relationship, left Paris to live near her mother at Blois. From time to time she made short visits to the city, and it was on one of these occasions that she died in October, 1767. Madame Renaudin was now in full control of the situation, and to consolidate her power she began to lay plans for the future. The pension of 450 livres which M. de la Pagerie had obtained from the court proved very useful when he was practically ruined by the great storm of August, 1766, which, combined with an earthquake, devastated Martinique, throwing down houses and destroying plantations. On the Taché estate nothing was left standing except the sugar refinery, to which the family fled for shelter. In this building, altered so as to make it habitable, the family continued to live for the next 25 years. Aubenas visited the place in the middle of the last century, when it was not much changed since the days of Josephine's childhood. The village Trois-Îlets then contained about 50 frame houses, and a small church in which was the family vault of the Taché. The plantation was located about a mile beyond the town, and the description of Aubenas is interesting. The homestead is situated on a slight eminence surrounded by larger hills, only a few steps from the sea, although it is out of sight and even out of hearing. From the extent of the buildings still standing, and the ruins which the eye can make out, it is possible to judge the former importance of the estate, one of the largest in this once flourishing quarter of the island. The dwelling house, originally constructed on a large scale, has become since the storm of 1766 a simple wooden structure. Next comes the sugar mill with its circle of heavy pillars and its huge roof of red tiles of native manufacture. A few paces from the mill is the refinery, a large building over 40 yards long by 20 wide. On looking at the monumental solidity of this structure, it is possible to understand how it withstood the terrible storm. During the years which followed, the building was adapted to shelter the Taché family. A low gallery was added on the southern side, and rooms were fitted up in the upper part until a new dwelling house could be erected. Built on the slope of the hill were the huts of the negroes, and round about were the sheds and other buildings used in the manufacture of the sugar. Amid such surroundings the future Empress and Queen passed the years of her childhood, with no society except that of the slaves, and no culture, intellectual or moral. When she was 10 years of age she was sent to the school of the Dames de la Providence at Fort Royal, where she remained 4 years. Her education was then thought to be complete, and she returned to Troisillet. In fact, she had received little more than a primary school training, with a few lessons in music and dancing. At this time Josephine was far from being the finished coquette that she became later on. She had a good complexion, fine eyes, pretty hands and feet; but her face was full, without marked traits, her nose relevée and ordinary, her figure heavy and ungraceful. Her mind was hardly cultivated, but to the convent she owed at least quite an elegant penmanship, with an orthography not much worse than that of most of her contemporaries. She had a slender voice, and sang to the accompaniment of a guitar. In character she was very sweet, submissive to authority, very amiable, always ready to do any one a favor; and such she remained all her life. While Josephine was passing her childhood at Troisillet, the boy Alexandre de Beauharnais was living at Fort Royal with the elder Madame Taché. It was not until 2 years after the death of his mother, towards the end of the year 1769, that his father arranged to have him brought back to France. At that time he was 9 years of age. There is a record of his baptism, under date of 15th of January, 1770, on the parish registers of the church of St. Sulpice at Paris. His godmother was the haute et puissante Dame Marie Euphémie Désirée Taché de la Pagerie, épouse de Monsieur Renaudin, écuyer, ancien major de l'île de Sainte Lucie. In order to complete his education, which had been much neglected, Alexandre was placed with his brother in the Collège du Plessis, founded by the great Cardinal Richelieu, which at that time was the rival of Louis le Grand at Paris. Later the boys were sent for 2 years, with their tutor Patricole, to the University of Heidelberg to learn the German language. In 1774 François entered the army, and Patricole was engaged by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld as preceptor for the 2 sons of his sister, Rohan Chabot, and he took Alexandre with him. It thus happened that the most impressionable years of the boy's life were passed in the ducal château of Roche Guyon. During all these years Madame Renaudin never lost sight of him. She made every effort to secure over the son the same influence which she exercised over the father. In the plans which she had formed for the future, Alexandre held the principal rôle. The resources of the marquis were very limited, and the expenses of the household were paid largely from the income of the fortune which the boy had inherited from his mother. This money Madame Renaudin intended, if possible, to keep in the family. 2. 1779 1790. Marriage and separation. When Alexandre de Beauharnais was 16 years of age, in December 1776, he received, through the favor of the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, a commission as sous-lieutenant in his regiment of the Sarre Infanterie. At this time he abandoned the courtesy title of chevalier, then given to the younger sons of noble families, and assumed that of vicomte, to which he had no valid claim. Dressed in his handsome new uniform of white cloth with facings of silver gray, the young vicomte proceeded to Rouen, where his regiment had just arrived in garrison. Here he went through his military exercises, and perfected himself in mathematics and horsemanship. At this time he was far from thinking of marriage, but he did not know the plans of that high and mighty dame, his godmother. When he returned home to pass a 6 months' leave of absence, Madame Renaudin played her cards so well that Alexandre readily assented to her ideas, in order more quickly to enjoy his fortune. On the 23rd of October, 1777, the marquis wrote the following letter to Monsieur de la Pagerie: "Each of my children has at present an income of 40,000 livres. It is in your power to give me one of your daughters to share the fortune of my chevalier. The respect and attachment which he has for Madame de Renaudin make him ardently desire to be united to one of her nieces. I assure you that I only acquiesced in his wishes in asking you for the second, whose age is the most suitable for him. I deeply regret that your eldest daughter is not a few years younger; she certainly would have had the preference, for I have formed an equally favourable opinion of her. But I must admit that my son, who is only 17½ years old, thinks that a young lady of 15 is too nearly of his own age. There are occasions when sensible parents are forced to yield to circumstances." As Alexandre, besides the income of 40,000 livres from the estate of his mother, had expectations of 25,000 more, the marquis did not request Monsieur de la Pagerie to furnish any dot. He only asked that the father make haste to bring his daughter to France. or if he could not come himself, to send her with a trustworthy companion by a commercial vessel, as she would have a more comfortable and agreeable voyage. When this letter of the marquis reached Martinique, the second daughter of Monsieur de la Pagerie, Désirée, was dead of a malignant fever, at the age of 13, and the youngest daughter, Françoise, was not yet 12 years old. In January the father writes that, in default of the second daughter, he is willing to offer the third, but that it would be better to accept the first. He says that she, Josephine, has a very fine complexion and very beautiful arms, and that she is very anxious to go to Paris. Madame Renaudin's plan was that Alexandre should marry one of her nieces; she did not care whether it was the youngest or the oldest. Therefore, without wasting time in vain regrets over the death of Désirée, she wrote her brother, in March 1778, "Come with one of your girls or two. Whatever you do will be agreeable to us. We must have one of your children." In reply to this letter, Monsieur de la Pagerie wrote, the last of June, that his youngest daughter had been ill for 3 months, and was in no condition to travel, and that he would bring Josephine. When received in September, this information was communicated to Alexandre, who was then stationed with his regiment near Brest, and he accepted the substitution with good grace, though with little enthusiasm. Before Monsieur de la Pagerie could sail, however, France and England were again at war, and his departure was delayed for more than a year. Finally, in October, 1779, Madame Renaudin received a letter from her brother, announcing that he and his daughter had arrived at Brest after a terrible voyage, and that he was detained there by illness. She at once set out with Alexandre to join them. This was the first encounter between Alexandre and Josephine since their childhood days, as she was only 6 years old when he left Martinique. To judge by his letters to his father at this time, he was far from enthusiastic over his Creole fiancée. He said that she was not as pretty as his father might expect, but that the sweetness of her character surpassed anything that had been said of her. The party of 4 traveled slowly to Paris, where they arrived the middle of November, and joined the marquis in his hotel, Rue Thévenot, where he was just installed. The banns had already been published 3 times in Martinique in April, and they were now published again in Paris. Madame Renaudin at once occupied herself with ordering the trousseau, for which she expended the large sum of 20,000 livres. On the 10th of December the contract was signed at the hotel of the marquis in the presence of all the male members of the family, no ladies being present. Of the family of the bride there was present, aside from Monsieur de la Pagerie and his sister, only a very distant cousin. As Alexandre had so large an income, the marquis did not make any settlement on him at the time of the marriage. The dot of the bride was furnished by her aunt. Besides the trousseau already mentioned, Madame Renaudin gave her a house at Noisy-le-Grand, in the vicinity of Paris, which she had purchased in October, 1776, for the sum of 33,000 livres, and had furnished at a further cost of about 30,000 livres. To use the expression commonly employed by ladies in those days, and perhaps since, when they did not care to state from what source their money was derived, these funds were doubtless the "proceeds of her diamonds." 3 days after the signing of the contract, on the 13th of December, 1779, the marriage was celebrated in the church at Noisy, in the presence of nearly the same persons who witnessed the signing of the contract. No woman signed the register. Immediately after the marriage, the young couple took up their residence in the sombre hotel of the marquis in Paris. For the young Creole it was a sad change from the brilliant sunshine, the entire liberty, and the dolce far niente of the Antilles. The Beauharnais had few friends in Paris, and Josephine had not even an acquaintance. In the spring Alexandre returned to his regiment at Brest, and Josephine remained in Paris with her father-in-law, her aunt, and her father, who was still ill. Returning to Paris, when his regiment was ordered to Verdun, Alexandre made no effort to introduce his wife in society. He thought her awkward and ignorant. Even worse, she seemed to him plain, devoid of grace and tournure, with ridiculous ideas of conjugal love, tenderness, and jealousy. He had married to be free to enjoy his fortune, and he had no intention of being tied down to his wife. It was difficult enough to secure entry to the court for himself alone, and he owed his position there mainly to the fact that he was a fine dancer. He could never hope to introduce a wife who had neither money nor friends nor social position. In fact, despite the legends to the contrary, Josephine was never presented at the court of Marie Antoinette. While Alexandre visited from château to château, his wife continued to lead the same quiet, uneventful life at Noisy or at Paris. On the 3rd of September, 1781, she gave birth in the Hôtel Rue Thévenot to a son, who the following day was baptized in the church of Saint Sauveur, and received the name of Eugène. The 1st of November, Alexandre left Paris for a trip to Italy, from which he did not return until the end of July. For a short time after his return he was more attentive to his wife, but the improvement in their relations did not last long. One who knew him well has said that he was d'une grande coquetterie avec les femmes, and such he remained until the end of his life. Josephine was naturally of a jealous temperament, and she certainly had reason enough to faire des scènes. Alexandre was hardly back a month in Paris before he was thinking of leaving again. At that time, M. de Bouillé, the governor of the Windward Islands, was in France with the object of persuading the government to authorize an expedition against the English. Warmly supported by his old patron M. de la Rochefoucauld, Alexandre tried, but in vain, to secure the position of aide de camp to Bouillé. He was so determined to leave, however, that on the 26th September, 1782, he sailed for Martinique as a simple volunteer, having obtained an indefinite leave of absence from the Minister of War. He arrived at the island in the month of November, but found no chance to distinguish himself as the war was drawing to a close. The preliminaries of peace were signed the 20th of January, 1783, and all hostilities ceased in the Antilles as soon as the news was received. On the 10th of April, 1783, a daughter was born to Josephine in the new Hôtel of the Marquis, Rue St. Charles, and was baptized the following day as Hortense Eugénie. In the certificate the father is described as Vicomte de Beauharnais, Baron de Beauville, capitaine au régiment de la Sarre, actuellement en Amérique pour le service du roi. At that time it took at least 2 months for a letter to go from Paris to Martinique, and Alexandre did not receive the news before the middle of June. After waiting 3 weeks, he wrote to Josephine as follows: "If I had written you in the first moment of my anger, my pen would have burnt the paper. But for more than 3 weeks I know, at least in part, what I wish you to understand. In spite, then, of the despair of my soul, the rage which suffocates me, I shall know how to restrain myself. I shall know how to tell you coldly that you are in my eyes the vilest of human beings; that my stay here has enabled me to learn of the abominable life you led here; that I know in the fullest particulars your intrigue with M. de B., officer of the Régiment de la Martinique, also that with M. Dache. I know, finally, the contents of your letters, and I will bring with me one of the presents you made. I do not ask you for repentance; you are incapable of it. A person who, while making her preparations to depart, could receive her lover in her arms, when she knows that she is destined for another, has no soul. She is lower than all the coquines on earth. What can I think of this last child, born more than 8 months after my return from Italy? I am forced to accept it, but I swear by the Heaven which enlightens me that it belongs to another, that it is the blood of a stranger which flows in its veins. Make your own arrangements accordingly. Never, never will I put myself in a position to be abused again, and as you are a woman to impose on the public if we live under the same roof, have the goodness to retire to a convent as soon as you receive my letter. It is my last word, and nothing on earth can make me change it. I will go to see you on my arrival in Paris. Once only. I wish to have a talk with you, and to give you something." It is impossible to read this letter without feeling that Alexandre at the time sincerely believed that he had been wronged by Josephine both before and after their union. During his stay in Martinique he had begun as usual to courir les femmes, and had formed a liaison with a young woman who was an enemy of the Tachets, jealous of the fine marriage which Madame Renaudin had arranged for her niece, and ready to employ all means to disturb the peace of the family. It was from her that Alexandre obtained the information as to Josephine's early love affairs. After arranging to meet his mistress in Paris, Alexandre sailed the middle of August, and arrived in France 6 weeks later. He found awaiting him at the port letters from his father and Madame Renaudin attempting to bring about a reconciliation. En route for Paris he wrote Josephine that he was surprised to learn that she was not yet in a convent, and that his decision was unalterable. On receiving this letter at Noisy, Josephine rushed to Paris to meet her husband on his arrival, but Alexandre did not go to his father's house. Every possible effort was made by the Marquis and Madame Renaudin to effect a reconciliation, but the Vicomte remained inflexible. After a month of fruitless attempts, Josephine retired with her aunt to the Abbaye de Pantimont, Rue de Grenelle, and early in December began a formal action for separation. In her complaint she sets forth in the greatest detail the existence which she has led; the indifference of her husband, who in nearly 3 years of married life has passed less than 10 months with her. In conclusion, she states the formal refusal of her husband to resume their life in common, and files a copy of the letter quoted above, which constitutes her principal grievance against him. It is certain that if Alexandre had any proofs of the misconduct of Josephine subsequent to their marriage, he would not have hesitated at this time to bring them forward. The allegation regarding Hortense is disproved by a simple examination of the dates. As for the other charges, 15 months later he voluntarily and explicitly withdrew them. In March, 1785, he met Josephine in the office of his notary and consented formally to a separation. All the provisions of this act are greatly to the honor of Josephine, and prove conclusively that there was no basis for the grave charges Alexandre had made when under the spell of an ignoble woman. Josephine was to live where she pleased; to receive from her husband an allowance of 5,000 livres a year; to have the custody of Eugène until he was 5 years old; to keep Hortense, for whose maintenance her father was to pay 1,000 livres quarterly in advance until she was 7 years old, and 1,500 livres after that age. Alexandre further agreed to pay all the legal expenses of the suit. Such was the end of this famous action, from which Josephine carried off all the honors of war. The sojourn of Josephine at Pantimont was of great advantage to her in every way. The Abbaye was like an immense furnished hôtel of the highest respectability, open only to women of la première distinction, and there Josephine for the first time had an opportunity of meeting women of her own social rank. She was received as the Vicomtesse de Beauharnais, an unfortunate, irreproachable young woman, the victim of a cruel husband. For a woman of the world, Josephine already possessed 2 of the essential requisites. She was a coquette, and she knew how to lie. In these 2 respects her husband undoubtedly had a grievance against her. And to these 2 qualities Josephine adds, by the faculty of assimilation which is one of her strongest traits, that physical education which in a new society is to place her in a class by herself. Little by little a transformation is effected in her personality, which changes the heavy and awkward Creole into a being delicate and souple, a being desirable above all, who knows how to attract and to hold. From every point of view this retreat of 15 months was profitable to her. On leaving the Pantimont early in 1786, Josephine, at 23 years of age, found herself free, with an income of 9,000 livres for the support of Hortense and herself. At this time she sold the estate at Noisy, and with the proceeds she bought at Fontainebleau a little house, where she went to live with her aunt and the Marquis. They had a few friends in that locality, and in their society the days passed pleasantly. At that time the court was obliged to practice the strictest economy, and for 2 years the royal hunt was abandoned. In September, 1786, under the terms of the act of separation, Eugène was sent to his father, who placed him at school. Hortense was brought home from Chelles, where she had been for 2 years with a nurse, and was at once inoculated by orders of the Marquis, who was a great believer in all innovations. Abandoned at 23 years by her husband, whose liaisons with other women were open and notorious, attractive, passionate, extremely coquette, is it probable that Josephine did not have a lover? Several names have been mentioned in this connection, but we have no proofs. All we know is that in June, 1788, Josephine suddenly sailed for Martinique, taking Hortense with her. None of her biographers has ever been able to find a satisfactory explanation of this voyage. It has been surmised that it was either for the purpose of concealing the results of her imprudence, or else was on account of the pressing need of money. But if the latter, was it not easier to await at Fontainebleau the remittances of her father, who acted as agent of the marquis, than to go 3,000 miles in search of them? In default of any documents, we are reduced to conjectures, and with our knowledge of Josephine can only imagine one of two reasons: debts or love. The biographers friendly to Josephine attribute her journey to the former cause; but it is rather strange that her enemies have not seized on the fact that De Cretz, writing by Napoleon's orders in 1807, spoke of "the demoiselle of 18 years whom Madame de la Pagerie has adopted." Had this girl, known as Marie Benaquette Taché de la Pagerie, been really only 18 years of age at that time, she must have been born early in 1789, that is to say, during this visit of Josephine, and not in March, 1786, as stated in the document of doubtful authenticity already mentioned. Therefore, on the ground of date alone, there was no reason why Marie Joseph Rose, as stated in the certificate, could not have been the mother instead of Marie Françoise. Turcan, who is always unfriendly to Josephine, does not hesitate to insinuate that Josephine had a daughter during this visit to Martinique in 1789, 6 years after her separation from her husband, and gives as his authority a study of M. Frédéric Masson upon Joséphine avant Bonaparte, published in the Revue de Paris. This girl, Marie Benaquette, was married in March, 1808, to the private secretary of the Captain General of Martinique, a M. Blanchet, and her dot of 60,000 francs was provided by the Emperor, doubtless at the request of Josephine. The whole episode is a curious one, to say the least. Whatever her motive may have been, Josephine was in great haste to leave France at the earliest possible moment. Finding on her arrival at Havre that the government vessel which she had expected to take could not sail for 2 weeks, she engaged passage for Hortense and herself on a private ship, and sailed at once. The voyage was pleasant and rapid. Arrived at Martinique, Josephine went directly to Trois Îlets, where she remained nearly 2 years. We have no record of this visit, but her life must have been very dull. The family was very poor, and both her father and her sister Françoise were ill. Her father died in November, 1790, 2 months after Josephine's departure, and her sister a year later. End of chapters 1 and 2.